Now, it's an interesting development in the United States because you have a lot of different solutions in different states and different cities. What would you say that we could take from you? What could we learn from some of the best examples in the US?
It's a really good question because we've been struggling to do the opposite, which is to say that our regulatory environment is so different. What can we learn from your successes as well? I think that it's really important. I mean, from my philosophical approach, we think it's really important to make sure that communities have autonomy to experiment and to recognize that there's a diversity of approaches that are needed. We often say that no one knows the local assets and the local challenges better than the local unit of government, and they're the ones that are closest and most accountable to the public. And so I think when you look in the United States, a lot of the fiber to the home pioneering was done by cities that were up for it. And I think that it's important, and I don't know exactly how this works in Sweden. I would expect in general the atmosphere to be more favorable to it. But in the United States, we've only recently seen communities that say, we're willing to pay for a part of the infrastructure with taxes. In many communities, that's enough to get an elected official fired, removed from office over time. But there's some communities who say this is so important, it's just like the roads. If we expect the network to pay for itself entirely, we're not going to have the networks that we need for a modern economy.
So that's part of the solution. I know, Eric, that we have questions for Christopher on Twitter.
Absolutely. The flow stream here on Twitter is tremendous. I'm impressed. We have a question from the source Stockholm ICT. What do you think the end goal is with Google Fiber?
Well, we've had varying opinions over the last few days as we talk about it. I do think that the end goal, the ultimate goal for Google believes Google needs to connect people with advertisers, and they want people to use the internet. Google thinks the more that we use the internet, the better their business will be. And so ultimately, Google's goal is to get as many people on fast, affordable, and reliable connections as possible. Now, I think I've been worried, frankly, that Google is going to expand its fiber across the entire United States because we've seen a little bit of reaction from cable and telephone companies to it in Austin. And maybe we'll see more now that they're talking with more communities. But the cable and telephone companies have basically said, nobody needs a gig. So my fear is that Google could be the next big monopoly. And although Google's interests are very much aligned with consumers to a far greater extent than we see with the cable and telephone companies, the decisions that we make now are going to be with us for decades. And just sort of running into another monopoly, particularly one of the power and all-encompassing nature of Google, is not something we should take lightly, I think. So I think it's very important, and I think what Google's doing has really moved us forward. I just don't want them to be the only ones moving us forward, I guess.
But don't you see, when they're moving in, like they're doing Google, don't you see the cable and telecommunications companies stepping up to...
So in Kansas City, AT&T basically didn't say anything and didn't do anything. In Chattanooga, when they built their network, Comcast lowered its prices and brought the DOCSIS 3, the next level of cable, in faster than they would have. But it's not like Comcast is doing fiber to the home in Chattanooga. In many cities, we see prices go down, and in a few cities, we see more investment. But for the most part, I think the cable companies think that they can just prevent competition through state laws and at the federal level. And in the areas where there is competition, maybe they'll take a little bit of losses, but they'll still largely not have to worry about it. So, and I think Google's recognizing that in expanding the network. I think they're trying to send a message. But I also think that there's money to be made here, and I think Google is sensing that. One final thought is just, people have to understand, we often think of Google as a cohesive whole. We think of cities as a cohesive whole. There's warring units within all of these entities. And Google hired Milo Medin to run the Google Fiber project, and he's a person that has ambition. And he, it's the reason that they've done it, and I think they've gone with him, and he's going to want to expand it. He wants to bring this network to more people. And so there's internal reasons for expanding it that we may not immediately associate with the Google that we imagine, that we understand.
Eric, do you have further questions on Twitter?
No, that's it for now.
That's it for now. Do we have anything from the floor for Christopher? Yes. Maybe we'll give you this one. Okay.
So, Chris, just very quickly, it's maybe more of a kind of general culture question. The states that you painted in red, do they tend to be red states?
Oh, it's
Politically red states,
Yes.
you would say. Yeah.
Not entirely. And even within that, it's important to note that, I'm sure you're all aware, the more conservative folks in the United States are Republicans, and what we call the more liberal is the more democratic. And I understand with European politics, that's not always how you would describe our politics. The places that have built those networks are overwhelmingly conservative. They vote Republican. And the states, it varies. But really, it depends on how powerful the cable companies are. And to some extent, my personal bias is that I think it depends on how busy the lobbyists are. You know, if you're a cable lobbyist, you need to find something to do. And if you don't have an agenda for that year in the session, you might be casting around trying to justify your expenses to the company. And so you think, well, let's go after the municipalities and make sure they can't build networks. And I think that there's some of that. And so it's not always the explanations you might think. But in polling, about 2 out of 3 Americans, whether they vote Republican, Democratic, or Independent, 2 out of 3 think that this decision should be made at the local level. The reason that we see 19 states banning it and discussions in Washington, D.C. That don't respect the local right to build networks is entirely because of the role of corporations in terms of financing our elections. The cable and telephone companies are incredibly powerful, and they have the ways of getting their agenda across. To give you an idea, Comcast is the 7th largest lobbyist in Washington, D.C. If it swallows Time Warner Cable, it could become the 4th largest, these are the top 3 are trade groups. So for a single corporation to have that kind of power, these are powerful corporations, and it's important to note that in the United States, I think we spend a lot of time with what I think of as just theater, where a lot of us know that the argument is false, but we have to go through the motions of saying, really, 4G is not a competitor to a good wired connection. And it's an argument that we have to have time and time again, because so many people are out there putting out papers saying, oh, yes, it is. It's wonderful. You can do everything you ever wanted to do on a 4G network. It'll cost you $500 a month, but it's it's possible.
So quite some challenges ahead for you too.
Yeah, there's challenges, but it's important to note, I don't want to paint the pictures. I think in the United States, we have some of the best networks that are available in the nation. None of them are in New York, Miami, or Los Angeles, unfortunately, which were the 3 cities that were identified. But we have some wonderful networks, and we have areas that are really going to struggle. Oh, and there was one other thing, which is that there's a lot of fiber to the home in our rural areas because of cooperatives. The Midwest has a tremendous history with cooperatives. And so even though it touches very few people, you'd be surprised that some of the best access comes in some of our more rural areas because of that local pioneering spirit, which came about through cooperatives.
Christopher Mitchell, thank you very much
you.
for coming. Thank you.